She had only gone to the market to buy a little foodstuff when she noticed people whispering and staring at her. At first, she ignored it, but when the seller she usually bought from hesitated to serve her, she knew something was wrong. Then she heard it, low voices murmuring, "That's her, the girl who got pregnant without a husband." Her name was Grace, and she was barely 18. Grace was the daughter of a widow, a woman who struggled daily to feed her children by selling roasted corn by the roadside. They lived in a one-room mud house with a leaking roof, and on most nights they went to bed hungry. Life had been unkind to them, and even though Grace dreamt of a better future, she knew it was almost impossible. Then came Michael. Michael was the only man who ever made her feel special. He had smooth words, a confident smile, and promises that sounded like music to her ears. He told her she was beautiful, that she deserved more than poverty, and that he would take care of her. At first, she resisted his advances, but he was patient, gentle, and kind, or so she thought. One evening, after several months of his sweet words, he invited her to his place. She hesitated, but he reassured her. "I just want to talk, nothing else." She believed him. That night changed her life forever. A few weeks later, she started feeling sick in the mornings. Food no longer tasted the same, and she felt tired all the time. Her mother noticed and confronted her. "Grace, what is wrong with you?" Grace looked away, her heart pounding. "Answer me," her mother demanded. Tears filled Grace's eyes. I think I'm pregnant." The slap came so fast that she barely saw it. "Pregnant?" her mother cried out. "Whose child is it?" "Michael's," Grace whispered. Her mother stormed out, dragging her to Michael's house, but when they got there, they received the biggest shock of their lives. Michael denied everything. "I don't know what she's talking about," he said firmly. "I never touched her," Grace's mother pleaded. "Please, my daughter says the child is yours." Michael shook his head. "She's lying. I have never been with her." The humiliation was unbearable. People gathered, shaking their heads in disappointment. Grace had never felt so ashamed in her life. That was the beginning of her suffering. The whispers grew louder each day. Women in the village warned their daughters to stay away from her. The few suitors who had once admired her now looked at her with disgust. Even her mother, the only person she had left, could barely look at her without disappointment in her eyes. Months passed, and Grace gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Lily. But the struggles were just beginning. Her mother was getting older, and feeding another mouth became even harder. Grace tried to work, but no one wanted to hire a girl with a child out of wedlock. Then the men came. They came with smiles, kind words, and promises, but each time they had only one goal: to take advantage of her. The first one, Mr. Felix, was an elderly man who promised to take care of her if she would keep him company in return. The second, Daniel, a young trader, claimed he wanted to marry her, but on one condition: she had to prove she was good enough for him. The third, Chief Benson, a wealthy man, laughed when she refused his offer. "You have no choice, my dear. Who else will take you?" Each time she felt trapped, but she never gave in. She had made one mistake, and she would not make another. Then, one day, she met Richard. Richard was different. He did not look at her with judgment. He did not make empty promises. He was kind to Lily, something no man had ever been. At first, Grace was cautious. She had been tricked too many times, but Richard was patient. He did not rush her. He visited her mother, helped around the house, and treated Lily like his own child. Slowly, she began to trust him. Then, one evening, he proposed. "Marry me, Grace. Let's leave this village and start a new life together." Tears streamed down her face. For the first time in years, she felt hope. She accepted. The wedding was simple, but to Grace, it felt like a dream. She was finally leaving behind the whispers, the judgment, and the shame. But little did she know that her new life in the city would bring its own challenges. Challenges that would test everything she believed in. The moment Grace arrived in the city with her husband, she felt as if she had stepped into another world. The streets were wide, the houses were tall, and the people moved quickly, speaking in ways that made her feel small. She clung to her husband's arm as they walked into their new home. A house so big it made her old village hut seem like a forgotten memory. For the first time in her life, Grace had everything she had ever dreamed of: a warm bed, food in abundance, and clothes she never imagined she would wear. But as the days turned into weeks, a quiet fear began to creep into her heart. Her husband, the man who once knelt before her in love, started coming home late. At first, he would bring gifts, telling her he had to work long hours to provide for their growing family. But soon, the gifts stopped, and so did his explanations. One evening, after putting her daughter to sleep, Grace sat alone in the large living room, staring at the polished floors that reflected the dim chandelier light. She heard the door creak open and rushed to welcome her husband, but the moment she saw his face, she froze. His eyes were distant, his smile forced. "Grace," he said, pulling away from her embrace, "I need to talk to you." She swallowed hard. "What is it?" "I need you to understand something." He sighed, running a hand through his neatly cut hair. "Life in the city is different. You can't keep behaving like a village woman. You must learn how things are done here." Grace nodded, eager to please him. "I will learn." He studied her for a moment before turning away. "Good." Then, without another word, he walked past her and into the bedroom. That night, Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had done wrong. Weeks passed, and her husband became even more distant. He stopped calling her by the sweet names he once used. He no longer asked about their daughter. Whenever she spoke, he barely listened. One afternoon, while dusting the furniture, Grace overheard the housemaid whispering to one of the drivers. "She doesn't even know what's going on," the maid said, shaking her head. "The boss has another woman." Grace felt the breath leave her lungs. She pressed a hand against her chest, willing herself to stay calm. Another woman? She forced herself to walk away before they could see her, but the words echoed in her mind. That evening, she set the table for dinner, determined to act as if she had heard nothing. When her husband finally walked in, she smiled and served his food, watching him closely. "Is something wrong?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated. "Are you seeing someone else?" He didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. He simply wiped his mouth and leaned back in his chair. "Who told you that?" Grace's hands trembled as she picked up his empty plate. I heard things." Her husband stood up and adjusted his suit. "Grace, I warned you not to behave like a village woman. In the city, men don't like being questioned." Tears welled up in her eyes. "But I am your wife." He sighed and walked past her. "Be a good wife, and everything will be fine." That night, Grace wept silently. Days turned into months, and her marriage became a shadow of what it once was. Her husband barely spoke to her unless he had to. The love she once knew had faded, and all that remained was loneliness. But she wasn't just a wife, she was a mother. And no matter how broken she felt, she knew she had to stay strong for her daughter. Little did she know, the worst was yet to come. Before we continue this thrilling story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to keep the excitement going. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's dive back in. The echoes of Grace's lonely footsteps filled the grand mansion as she moved about restlessly. Each room was richly adorned, yet it felt empty. She had thought marriage to a wealthy man would bring her happiness, but it had only left her lonelier than she'd ever been in her poor village. The love and warmth she had once dreamed of had faded, replaced by a cold distance between her and her husband. One evening, as she stood by the large glass window watching the city lights, her baby girl, cried softly from her crib. Grace rushed to pick her up, rocking her gently in her arms. She whispered, "At least I have you, my love." But even as she spoke, she knew it wouldn't be enough. Her husband had changed. He no longer looked at her with admiration or spoke to her with affection. His work took all his time, and when he was home, he barely acknowledged her presence. At first, Grace convinced herself that he was just busy, that things would get better. But the more she tried to reach out, the more distant he became. One day, while clearing up his study, she found a strange perfume scent lingering on his clothes, a scent that was not hers. A deep unease settled in her chest, but she pushed the thought away. She didn't want to believe what her heart was telling her. Grace tried to silence the nagging thoughts in her mind, but they kept returning, louder each time. The scent of another woman on his clothes, his cold attitude, and his late nights all pointed to one thing, but she wasn't ready to admit it. She told herself she was imagining things. One morning, while folding his laundry, she noticed something even more unsettling. A small, neatly folded note tucked into the pocket of one of his suit jackets. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The words were brief but piercing. "Last night was beautiful. I can't wait to see you again." Grace felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she just sat there, staring at the note in disbelief. Her heart pounded so loudly that she could barely hear Hope's tiny giggles from her crib. A part of her wanted to confront him immediately, to throw the note in his face and demand answers, but another part, the part of her that had known too much suffering, told her to stay quiet, to wait and observe. That evening, she set the dinner table carefully, hoping he would at least sit with her for a meal. When he finally arrived home, much later than usual, she forced a smile. "You're home," she said softly. He nodded absent-mindedly, not even sparing her a glance as he loosened his tie. "I'm exhausted, Grace. I'll just eat in the study." Something inside her broke. She watched as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving her alone at the table, the food untouched. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the note in her hands. Her heart pounded as she read the words over and over again. It was a message from another woman, written with so much affection that it left no room for doubt. Her husband had been unfaithful. She clenched the paper tightly, her fingers trembling. How had she been so blind? She had believed she was finally living the life she had always dreamed of, yet here she was, betrayed, alone, and with a child to care for. That night, when her husband returned home, she decided to confront him. She had rehearsed her words in her head 100 times, but when she finally stood before him, her voice caught in her throat. "Who is she?" she finally managed to ask, holding up the note. Her husband sighed, rubbing his forehead as if she had just brought up an exhausting topic. "Grace, you're overthinking. It's nothing." "Nothing," she whispered, shaking her head. "This is a love letter, my husband. I trusted you." His face hardened. "I give you everything, a house, clothes, a life you never had before. And this is how you repay me? Accusing me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "All I wanted was a family. I never cared about the wealth. I just wanted a husband who truly loved me." He scoffed, loosening his tie. "You should be grateful, Grace. Women would do anything to be in your position." She stared at him in disbelief. He had changed so much. The man she once knew, the kind, caring man who had promised to love her, was gone. In his place stood someone who viewed her as an accessory, a trophy to display while he entertained himself elsewhere. Days passed, and Grace felt herself slipping into loneliness. He became more distant, barely speaking to her unless necessary. At night, he would stay out late, and when he returned, he smelled of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. The walls of their home felt suffocating. One afternoon, as she sat in the nursery watching her baby sleep, she made a decision. She had to secure a future for herself and her daughter. If he no longer loved her, then she needed to prepare for the worst. But before she could act on her thoughts, he dropped another unexpected news. "My mother is coming to stay with us for a while," he announced over dinner. Grace nearly choked on her food. "Your mother? But why didn't you tell me earlier?" He shrugged. "I just did. She'll be here tomorrow." Grace wasn't ready for this. She had met her mother-in-law only once before, and the woman had made it clear that she didn't think Grace was good enough for her son. Now, she was coming to stay? The next morning, Michael's mother arrived in grand fashion. She stepped out of a chauffeur-driven car, wearing elegant clothing and an expression of quiet disapproval. "Grace," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "I see you are managing." Grace forced a smile. "Welcome, Mother." As expected, life with his mother was a nightmare. She criticized everything Grace did, from how she dressed to how she cared for the baby. "You don't raise a child like this," she would say, snatching the baby from her arms. "No wonder my son is always stressed." Grace swallowed her anger and tried to endure, but the final blow came one evening when she overheard a conversation between son and his mother. "You should have married someone from a wealthy family," his mother sighed. "Not a girl who was already soiled before she met you." Grace felt her knees go weak. So this was how they saw her? No matter what she did, she would always be the poor village girl who had gotten pregnant before marriage. She knew then that she had no real place in this house. The city lights blurred through Grace's tears as she walked away from the mansion she once called home. The weight of her baby on her back was nothing compared to the weight in her heart. She had left everything behind, her comfort, her wealth, and the man she once loved. But, as the cold night wrapped around her, an even darker reality awaited her. Survival in a world that had already turned its back on her, once before Grace had nowhere to go. The house she once shared with her husband, the luxuries she had grown used to, even the housemaids who had served her, all of it was gone. She had walked through the lonely streets for hours, clutching her baby, before she finally found herself standing in front of a small guest house. The sign flickered in the night, the buzzing of the faulty neon light echoing the confusion in her mind. She pushed open the rusty gate and approached the reception. The man behind the counter barely spared her a glance. "Rooms are paid in advance," he muttered, not looking up. Grace hesitated. She had only taken the little money she had hidden in her drawer before leaving. She placed the bills on the counter. "How many nights will this give me?" The man finally looked up, eyeing her tired face and the sleeping baby in her arms. He counted the money lazily. 3 nights. 3 nights. That was all she had before she would have to figure out her next step. She nodded and took the key he slid across the counter. The room was tiny, barely enough space for the old bed, but Grace was too exhausted to care. She placed her baby on the bed and sat beside her, burying her face in her hands. She had given up everything, and now reality was settling in. She had to find a job. The next morning, Grace left her baby with a kind older woman who managed the guest house and went into the streets, looking for work. The city, once her playground, now seemed like a jungle. She walked into boutiques, restaurants, and even supermarkets, but everywhere she went, the response was the same. "We're not hiring." By the time the sun was setting, she was exhausted. She slumped onto a bench at a small roadside restaurant. The aroma of fried plantains filled the air, making her realize how hungry she was. A middle-aged woman in an apron approached her. "Are you okay, dear?" Grace forced a smile. "I'm just looking for work." The woman studied her for a moment. Can you cook? Grace hesitated, then nodded. She had learned a little while she was still in the village. The woman sighed. It's nothing fancy, but if you're willing to clean and help in the kitchen, I can give you a small salary. You can start tomorrow. Tears filled Grace's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thank you, she whispered. For the next few weeks, Grace worked tirelessly at the small restaurant. She cleaned tables, scrubbed pots, and cooked simple meals. It was hard, but it was honest work. At night, she returned to the tiny guest house, holding her baby close, whispering promises of a better future. But deep down, she knew she couldn't raise her child in a guest house forever. One evening, after closing the restaurant, she sat with her employer, Madame Esther. Do you have any family? Madame Esther asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. Grace hesitated. No one who would take me in. The older woman studied her. You're hard-working. I have a cousin who runs a home for single mothers. Maybe they can help you. Grace's heart clenched. The idea of living in a shelter hurt her pride, but she had to think of her baby. Can you take me there? She asked softly. The next day, they arrived at a small compound on the outskirts of the city. Women sat outside, some breastfeeding their babies, others sewing or washing clothes. A nun welcomed them. Many women come here with nowhere to go, she said gently. You can stay as long as you need while you get back on your feet. Grace nodded, holding her baby tighter. She had lost everything, but maybe, just maybe, she was finding something even greater, a chance to start over. The rain drummed heavily against the tin roof of the shelter as Grace sat by the window, lost in thought. It had been months since she started working at the restaurant, saving every penny she could, but it was barely enough to care for her child. The nun at the shelter had been kind to her, always reassuring her that things would get better. Yet, every passing day felt like a struggle. One evening, as she was wiping down tables after closing, a well-dressed woman entered the restaurant. She was in her early 40s, exuding an air of wealth and sophistication. She scanned the room briefly before her eyes landed on Grace. You must be Grace, the woman said with a small smile. Grace straightened up, confused. Yes, ma'am. Can I help you? The woman pulled out a chair and sat down. My name is Evelyn. I was told about you by Sister Margaret. I run a cleaning agency, and I'm looking for responsible women to work in some of my clients' homes. Would you be interested? Grace's heart skipped a beat. A real job, something stable, something that could pay better than the restaurant. But she hesitated. Will I be allowed to come home to my baby every day? Evelyn nodded. Of course. You'll be assigned to a home in the city. The pay is good, and if you prove yourself, there are opportunities to grow. It sounded too good to be true, but Grace had little choice. She accepted the offer immediately. The following Monday, Grace boarded a bus to the city with Evelyn. As the vehicle weaved through the busy streets, memories of her old life flooded her mind. The tall buildings, the lavish stores, the luxury cars. This had once been her world. But now, she was returning as a housemaid, not a housewife. The car Evelyn arranged for her stopped in front of a grand mansion with towering gates and an elegant driveway. A driver let her inside, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. The house was magnificent. Polished marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and walls lined with expensive artwork. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over Grace. You must be the new maid. Yes, ma'am, Grace said politely. My name is Mrs. Davenport. I expect professionalism and discretion in my home. You will be in charge of cleaning the upper floors. Your uniform is in the quarters behind the house. Be punctual, and don't touch anything unnecessary. Grace nodded, lowering her gaze. She had once worn expensive clothes and hosted grand parties, yet here she was, dressed in a maid's uniform, scrubbing floors. But she reminded herself. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for her child. Weeks passed, and Grace adapted to her new life. The work was exhausting, but the pay was better than anything she had earned before. She had little time for herself, often falling asleep immediately after returning to the shelter at night. One evening, while dusting the bookshelves in the study, she noticed a familiar fragrance in the air. Her hands trembled as she turned around. The cologne, the leather chair, the faint sound of classical music playing from the speakers. Everything about the room was eerily familiar. Then a deep voice cut through the silence. Grace? Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, and there he was, her husband. For a moment, neither of them moved. The man she had once loved, the father of her child, stood before her in utter shock. He looked different, more refined, more powerful, and the sight of him ignited something deep within her. Pain, anger, and years of unanswered questions. You work here? He asked, his voice unreadable. Grace clenched her fists. Yes, I do. He took a step closer, his eyes dark with disbelief. You disappeared. I looked for you. She let out a bitter laugh. You looked for me? After everything you put me through? After your mother humiliated me and you barely defended me? His jaw tightened. Grace, I never stopped thinking about you. Don't, she cut in. Don't act like you cared. Just then, Mrs. Davenport's voice echoed from downstairs, calling for Grace. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving her husband standing alone in the study. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, haunted by the encounter. Why was he here? Was this fate or a cruel trick of destiny? The next morning, she avoided the study and kept her head down, focusing on her work. But, as she was leaving for the day, the driver stopped her. Mr. Davenport wishes to speak with you before you go, he said. Please, I need to see my daughter Grace, he pleaded with her. All right, I'll think about all of it. The night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth as Grace walked home, her daughter sleeping soundly on her back. The day had been long, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had barely stepped onto the narrow path leading to her small room when a shadow emerged from the corner. She froze. The man standing there was the last person she expected to see. Dressed in a fitted shirt and dark trousers, his face held an expression she couldn't decipher. Shock, relief, longing. Grace, he breathed, stepping forward. I found you. Her heart pounded violently. She tightened her grip on her sleeping child, her mind racing. How had he found her? Why was he here? You followed me? Her voice was barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes not leaving hers. I had to. After seeing you at the mansion, I knew something wasn't right. Then I saw her. His gaze flickered to the little girl on her back. She looks exactly like me when I was a child, Grace. Grace turned away, fumbling with the key to her tiny one-room house. You shouldn't be here, she muttered. How? Please, he said, his tone softer now. We need to talk. She hesitated, but eventually pushed the door open and stepped inside. The small room was dimly lit, with only a single lantern casting weak shadows on the walls. A thin mattress lay on the floor, covered with a neatly folded blanket. The wooden table near the window held a single cup and a plate, remnants of their last meal. He took in the surroundings, and for the first time, she saw something unexpected in his expression. Guilt. You've been living like this? He asked, almost to himself. Grace carefully laid her daughter on the mattress, then turned to face him, arms crossed. What do you want from me? His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. The truth. Why did you leave without telling me? Why did you take my child away from me? She laughed bitterly. Your mother made sure I had no choice. She threw money at me and told me to disappear. And I did. Because I had no one. Now, here you are, years later, acting like you care. His hands clenched into fists. I didn't know, Grace. I swear, I didn't know. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. I won't leave you two like this. Grace scoffed. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm coming back tomorrow, he declared, and I'm taking both of you with me. You and my daughter belong in the mansion with me, not in this place. Her chest tightened. You can't just decide that for us. Watch me, he cut in. Grace, I missed years of her life. I won't miss another day. I'm coming back for you both. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Grace staring at the closed door, her emotions tangled in a mess of fear, anger, and something else she wasn't ready to name. The next morning, the soft knock on the door came, just as Grace was brushing her daughter's hair. Her heart skipped a beat. She already knew who it was. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. He stood there, dressed in another sharp suit, looking like he belonged to a different world. But there was something about his stance, the determination in his eyes that made her chest tighten. I meant what I said, he told her firmly. Pack your things. You're coming with me. Grace bit her lip, torn between pride and the undeniable truth. This man was the father of her child, and he wasn't going to walk away again. Would she be making a mistake by going back with him? Or had fate given her a second chance? She looked down at her daughter, then back at him. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new,